Plated Traditions Channel. Welcome to the Plated Traditions Channel with your host Kendra Moses. This is the Plated Traditions.
Hello and welcome to the Plated Traditions Channel. My name is Kendra Moses, and as always, off camera we have our resident chef Kai. So this week we're continuing the discussion about spices and herbs and I guess flavor enhancing in general. I've kind of lumped those two together because they're kind of unavoidable when it comes to making food. And so we've mentioned the differences, the baseline differences at least, of spices and herbs and how they're found basically sometimes off the exact same plant, most of the time off the exact same plant. And they're just different components of the plant. That one component, like the seeds, are usually categorized as our spices, and the leafy bits, and sometimes the actual flesh is characterized as our herbs. So before I go on, I do have a clip, just two other things I didn't cover to break down the parts of spices and herbs and different plants. There was just a couple more examples, but I didn't want to go too far over in time for that. So I'll see you that way, and when we get back, we'll continue our regular discussion. So we talked about plants having both herbs and spices on it, but there's a tree out there that even goes further than that. See, this tree has a nutmeg fruit. Obviously, nutmeg is going to be involved, and that is the case, just like it was for the coriander plant. Coriander seed, even though the leaf of it was referred to as cilantro. And these two things changed though. They came in the same plant, but the cilantro is an herb, and the coriander is a spice. But we have a tree where it produces two spices. So two spices comes from the exact same tree. And not only does the tree produce two spices, the nutmeg fruit around it is actually fruit. It's actually a fleshy fruit. So when we cut open that fruit, we see what we think is merely a seed, but it's not merely a seed. You kind of have this fibrous red matter around it, reddish brown matter around it. Someone in all their wisdom decided that they're going to separate this fibrous matter from around the seed. Now probably it could be because they thought it wasn't necessary because they wanted to plant another, they just wanted the seed itself. It didn't seem like it was part of the seed. But again, like everyone else in our history who took the chance to taste everything, they noticed a slight difference, and they said, we're going to use both of these things. Came from the same tree. We can utilize this fruit, the fleshy part, and we can take this fibrous matter off the seed itself. We'll call the seed nutmeg, but this fibrous matter we call mace. So we have this tree that's really working overtime. The tree is producing you a fruit, it's giving you a seed to start over again, and it's giving you this fibrous matter around the seed that also has its own flavor profile as well. This also is edible as well. When you want something spicy, the heat from the pepper does not come from the flesh, it comes from the seed. So if you want something very hot and spicy, you're going to use the seeds. And in turn, if you want the actual added flavor profile of the pepper, you're going to use the flesh. And when this happens, many peppers are actually dried, and they're dried with their seeds or without. And when this happens, when we go to the store, we classify them as typically as spices. They're usually seen in our spice aisle. Now thinking about the what are you talking about segment, I did get to this particular plant, but they do have a different way in most places overseas of classifying a pepper, and they do it actually basically using the Latin for it, capsicum. It doesn't matter what genus of the pepper. All peppers are classified as capsicums. So it doesn't matter if it's hot, if it's sweet, it's a capsicum. It's a pepper. Quite a few people in countries overseas, that's how they label them. It's capsicums. So if you try to discuss with someone, especially if you're someone from the States trying to discuss with someone overseas, where they just call all peppers capsicums, and you're worried about saying things like, yeah, it's a green pepper right there, that's a red pepper, a yellow one, that's a sweet one, like we do, and like we advertise and everything else. And they said, yeah, that's what I said, capsicum. If you push that fact, you may have an issue between the two of you, depending on how important it is to you, because you're hearing something different. And so that's one tick possibly in your head that's making you particularly filled with angst. Okay, you're from different places. Yeah, it may be called different things. But in this case, even though a pepper is called two different things, which, for all intents and purposes, a pepper is a capsicum here as well. Because if we said the Latin for it, it's a capsicum. It doesn't really change. We just identify it as the different genuses of peppers. It's important to us to say, I want a green pepper, a red pepper, a yellow pepper, a sweet pepper, a habanero pepper, a jalapeno pepper, a ghost pepper. It's important for us to do these distinctions. And for some, you can understand because, especially we talk about like the Carolina Reaper, the ghost peppers, the habaneros, these are very hot peppers. So it's important to make sure that we know the difference, because that could be the difference between somebody enjoying their meal and somebody possibly being hospitalized because they couldn't take the heat of the peppers. Because peppers like this is what gets you back to the discussion too about gloves. When you're handling peppers like this, it's highly advised to either use gloves or make sure that you wash your hand constantly after handling it. Because if you do something without thinking, like you have the peppers, you're working with everything else, maybe you're working really hard in the kitchen, a bead of sweat gets into your eye, you go to rub your face, and you have that pepper debris on your hand. You thought the onion made you cry. So you want to be careful with things like this. So I understand from this point of view, not to be biased, but I understand why it may be a difference for doing the differentiations here. But for the most part, where a lot of foods are really spicy anyway too, in those places where they just say capsicum, is neither here or there, and they know what they're looking for. So if they know they want a green pepper, they just look for a green pepper. They just look for the type of pepper they want. They're not concerned about calling it a green pepper. So if you try to push that as someone from the States to someone over there who calls all peppers capsicums, rightfully so, scientifically so, it might just seem like it could have the possibility of, instead of you trying to make someone else seem like they're possibly mistaken, it can possibly make you seem like you may be a little dense, because why is it so important for you to tell me the color of that pepper? I said it was a capsicum. It's a capsicum. It's a pepper. It's a pepper. So, and I know there are differences, but for the sake of classifications, just not enough so. But to be pulling this conversation back though to the spices, even if you have the flesh of the pepper, if it's been in the process of being all dried up, especially ground up, it turns into essentially what we classify as a spice. And I know this changes what used to be a clear-cut differentiation between a spice and an herb. But this continues on because we have the same thing with garlic. Now, garlic is a plant, and it can also be classified as a vegetable. But we still call it a spice when we work with it, not an herb, because the bulb. The bulb is essentially our seed for the garlic. So not everything grows from a hard seed. But when you have a clove of garlic, you can actually make another plant from that does have the ability to sprout. And being that it has the ability to sprout is essentially the seed, which essentially makes it a spice, even if we don't see it in a dried, granulated fashion. But especially when we see it in a dry, granulated fashion, we automatically know, yeah, it's a spice. So that's typically what we do, our differentiations. We see most of our powdered, granulated flavor enhancers, anything that looks really coarse and seeded, we automatically say that's a spice. Again, we look for more leafy things, even more fleshy things, in order for something to be called an herb. Even if it's dried, it still will be very reminiscent of a leaf, more than a seed, or more than the actual item that it grows from, which in the garlic's case would be its clove. So this week, to continue, like I said, we're still focusing on herbs and spices, but I guess this week we're focusing a little bit more on spice, more specifically on the term and the terminology. Like I said, we've already kind of bunkered down on the difference between an herb and a spice and where spices typically come from. But we do have a way of using certain terminology, and it's either interchangeably or it's either with a very loose translation. So food and flavor enhancing and eating is all about personal preference. So when we get down to the base of certain, categories of deciding what type of eater you are, we come to the word spicy. The word spicy usually is not that far off. But again, when we come to the word spicy, some have a baseline definition or understanding of it as something being automatically hot. And while others just see spicy as it being spicy, which means being typically pungent or aromatic. Now, if we go to a dictionary, I'm afraid the latter of the two wins this debate, because for something to be spicy is pungent and it's fragrant, the aroma in the air. Spicy is one of those words that is really definitive of a lot of different things. Just has very familiar or originating sense of smell that either comes from a spice or a number of spices. And that's when we come back to your ideology based on your introspection and your preferences when it comes to food flavoring and enhancing. And this often happens with the use of herbs and spices, and used for its purposes of enhancing your food through its aroma, its pungent smells, and or tastes. When the word spicy is used, it usually has a direct link to something being hot. If they're really pedantic and not quite sure about the true definition of spicy, that's the dictionary definition of spicy, they may see something advertised or labeled as hot and spicy and say, well, that's quite redundant. That makes no sense. I mean, why put both of them? But actually, it can make perfect sense. But whether or not the company who's marketing to you knows that or feels that way is kind of anyone's guess. The loose translation of spicy that I've noticed a great deal over here in the US is that it's hot. So if you think of things being spicy, it's hot. But then there's another way the actual dictionary way of looking at the word spicy. See, by a dictionary point of view, it's just something that is pungent and aromatic, and is done so usually by the use of a bunch of spices, or a choice amount of spices, or a choice selection of spices. But I think these lines get blurred because we think, like, we turn the bottle of ketchup over, that spicy ketchup over, or we turn the package of those hot and spicy buffalo wings. We're going to see things listed. Now, they might not give you everything specifically, but at the very least, they will tell you spice. Still, that only really checks the box for the dictionary definition. It says spicy, it has spices in it, and it's automatic. But when we think about things like buffalo wings, made sure to bring up buffalo wings is because buffalo wings are typically thought of to have some heat effect. There are some spices out there that do have a natural warming sensation, so to speak. They can be very hot. And when we say this, and we think about those spices, and we think about something like those wings, even in that sentence, we automatically, it's almost like we have to pull ourselves back from saying, and spicy. But the and spicy part is not necessarily wrong. It's just that spicy to be thought of as something just being indicatively hot is not always the case. However, like I said, I see where this line, the distinction, could get muddled. Because we have spices, even depending on the person, and even if the person does have a high tolerance for heat in their food, peppercorns can have the effect of feeling quite spicy in the heat sense. You have enough pepper on something, and it can build up that feeling of heat and that sensation of being very hot. However, peppercorns aren't necessarily a really heat type of spice. It's pungent, assuredly. It's aromatic, assuredly. And that what makes it a spice, along with it being from the seed. But it's not necessarily like what we think about for a hot spice like we do most members of the capsicum. So yeah, capsicums are basically all the members of the pepper family. But all the members of the pepper family are not hot. A lot of them are used to become spices, and some of them, their seeds will affect the heat index, some of them not so much. Like if you're using the bell peppers. Now the bell peppers are typically used to make paprika. Now paprika has a nice aromatic smell and pungency, and especially if you get it smoked, there's nothing like smoked paprika, but it's not necessarily a hot spice. Because the seeds of bell peppers are typically not hot at all. They don't really hold capsaicin in them. That sensation of giving you that heat index that most people who like it spicy go for. So you have to think about actual peppers like the Carolina Reaper, the ghost peppers, the chili peppers, the habaneros, even the jalapenos. These are the members of the capsicums. These are the members of the pepper family that actually give you that heat. And as I said, it's not necessarily their flesh that give you the heat. It's those seeds that give you the heat. Now, because the peppers have their seeds in the inside, they are essentially called a fruit. When I also mentioned about the nutmeg and mace, the nutmeg fruit off that tree is called a fruit because the seed inside of it. So it's a fruit that is producing a spice. And this is not uncommon, but this is how we differentiate as basic terms for the science part of everything. And most times we just go along and say, I just want that fruit, I just want that spice, that herb, that vegetation. But this is why they get these distinctions. So since The seeds are located in the inside of the pepper. The pepper is a fruit that's essentially an entire spice because we use the flesh of the peppers as well. They usually dry it out, and sometimes the seeds are kept, sometimes are not, depending on the pepper and how you want to actually use it. And as I said, some species of them give you what we loosely translate as spicy food, because we're just thinking about the heat. We're thinking about those seeds being kept in there and being ground up with the flesh and everything else to give us that heat index that we crave and desire. That's why the verbiage and understanding the verbiage of culinary arts is so important sometimes, because, and then one thing I always want to keep reminding, it's a learn as you go process. It's a hands-on process. It would probably be maddening and honestly boring if you just waited to read an entire book to call yourself learning everything there is about food and cooking. I don't honestly think that's even possible to do. I think you will have led an entire lifetime and not try to do anything in the kitchen, trying to get this ultimate definitive knowledge. I believe there's too many things that we end up classifying as food. There's too many things that we end up finding in the wild that we classify as edible to feel like we're gonna know every single thing about food before we enter a kitchen. So it's definitely a hands-on experience. But like I said, to remember to learn as you go, to remember what you hear and just learn as you go is the most important thing you will ever do, because that's when we find ourselves meeting these different variations of vocabulary and definitions and understanding. So spicy versus spicy. Like I said, for most people over here in the States, spicy is hot. If we see something that says spicy, we're expecting, or for some maybe dreading, heat. We don't want it because it's hot. But if you're someone like me and you see spicy, I want to see hot as well, but if my only understanding was that spicy would mean hot, I would be expecting something that's at least around the habanero range. I want the heat from the food if I want to classify it as just spicy. But I do realize that spicy doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be hot, because we have different cuisines all over the world. Designated as one of mankind's earliest foods and medicines, it has a lifespan attached to it that extends at least 5,000 years into our past. Its common name is garlic. Revered so much by the ancient Egyptians that this miracle plant was not only prescribed for ailments, it was also offered at the altar to honor their gods, even entombed with their royalty. The mighty garlic plant continued its noteworthiness across time and lands, influencing the Greeks and Romans in much the same way, inspiring strength in Olympic athletes, serving as offerings to the gods, and medicines to all the rest. Growing wild in parts of Asia and Europe, garlic has been kept close for good omens and protection against far more dangerous entities than illness. Garlic has made its way to many tables as ritual, medicine, and/or cuisine practically world over. It's said, though, that the Far East and certain parts of Europe consume considerably more garlic in their dishes. For me as a Westerner cook, I can't imagine my life or my plate of traditions without it.
Mixing tradition with innovation, a culinary dance, a feast for the senses, a gastronomic romance. In every dish, a piece of heart and soul.
Now that's something for our history books. Thank you again for joining us for another week. We hope to see you again next time. Bye-bye.